Good afternoon. I am Joe Shaw and want to welcome you and thank you for joining us in this virtual speakers series program on America's need for greater civility and bipartisanship in our actions, both domestically and internationally. This afternoon's program is being co-sponsored by my organization, the Colorado Foothills World Affairs Council, as well as World Denver and the Colorado Springs World Affairs Council. It is brought to us by Renew America Together. We also want to recognize the League of Women Voters of Colorado for their sponsorship and KOAA's news anchor Rob Quirk, who will moderate today's discussion. We are honored to have two exceptional national leaders and experts on this topic here today, General Wesley Clark and Governor Larry Hogan of Maryland. First, some procedural matters. If you would like to ask one of our speakers a question, please submit it at any time by going to your control panel and click on Question. If you don't see your control panel, look for the little orange arrow and that will open the control panel. Well, I'm now pleased to hand things over to my friend and colleague, Karen Burkhart, Executive Director of the Colorado Springs World Affairs Council.
Good afternoon. My name is Karen Burkhart. I'm the Executive Director of the Colorado Springs World Affairs Council. We're honored to have the opportunity to co-host this program in partnership with our sister councils, World Denver and Colorado Foothills World Affairs Council. It's my great pleasure to introduce the panelists and moderator for today's program. General Wesley Clark is a businessman, educator, writer, and commentator who serves as chairman and CEO of Wesley K. Clark and Associates, a strategic consulting firm. General Clark retired as a four-star general after 38 years in the United States Army. In 2019, General Clark founded Renew America Together, a nonprofit organization designed to promote and achieve greater common ground in America by reducing partisan gridlock and division. Maryland Governor Larry Hogan has spent nearly his entire career as a small businessman. In 2014, he became only the second Republican governor elected in Maryland in 50 years and the second to be reelected in the history of the state. National rankings consistently show Governor Hogan as one of the most popular governors in America. Rob Quirk is an Emmy Award-winning broadcast journalist. He has been the primary weeknight news anchor at News 5 for nearly 30 years. Rob says that he's honored and humbled to have been able to bring the most important stories of the day to our News 5 viewers, to act as an advocate for them, and work with them in developing a partnership and relationship that has kept News 5 the #1 source of news for Southern Colorado. And with that, I will turn the microphone and program over to General Clark. General Clark, I think you may need to unmute yourself.
If I can figure out. I had it working before. I apologize. It says I'm sharing my webcam, but I can't seem to get the.
There you go. We can see and hear you now.
I think I just turned it off, didn't I? All right. Is this?
There you go.
Okay.
You're just fine.
Karen, thank you. And Joe Shaw, thank you. And Rob for being here. And Governor Hogan, it's an honor to be with you again on this program. And thank you very much for joining us on Renew America Together. So we're given a couple of minutes at the start to talk about just whatever we want to talk about. And so I want to explain what Renew America Together is and why Governor Hogan and I are here. He's a Republican, and I ran for president as a Democrat, and I do give money to Democrats, but I got a lot of friends who are Republicans. But the real reason we're here together is because we think Americans have a lot more in common than what normally shows up in the partisan political dialogue in this country. And this is an opportunity for us to talk about the issues, to let you all ask questions, and to see what the real issues are facing America today. I was listening to one of the columnists on television last night, and he was saying that American politics is frivolous today, just frivolous, because we're talking about things that don't really matter. Maybe he's right, but there are issues that really do matter. And to me, the most important issue is American democracy. I was in the military. I raised my right hand. I took an oath to support and defend the Constitution. And the Constitution says that, we may be in different parties, but we're not enemies. We're working together for the common good, to provide for the defense, to promote the general welfare, and to do good things for the country. We may have different perspectives. So tonight's an opportunity to share those perspectives. And I think in the aftermath of January 6th, I think every American wants a little, a warm hug from the other side to say, we're all in this together, working together, trying to make the country better. So thank you very much for joining us on the program. And Governor Hogan, please.
Well, thank you very much. First of all, thank you, Joe and Karen. Thank you, Rob, for moderating this evening. I want to thank the World Affairs Council for hosting this really important discussion, and I particularly want to thank my friend General Clark for letting me be a part of this with him. And I want to thank everyone for taking the time to join us. And I want to thank you also. I want to thank the General and some of you for bringing this up, and thank you for your commitment to bipartisanship and civility. Ronald Reagan once said that we are at a time for choosing, and I think we are at another time for choosing in America. We're at a crisis point. So many Americans have stopped believing that democracy can work for them. After years of divisiveness and dysfunction in Washington, only 20% of Americans trust government to do the right thing. And in this void, many Americans have fallen prey to lies and conspiracy theories and demagogues. And this vicious cycle of destruction is eroding America's standing in the world. Because when America stops believing in itself, the world stops believing in us too. And we all have a choice to make. We can show those who feel forgotten that we can actually deliver real bipartisan, common sense solutions to all the serious problems that face us, or we can continue to perpetuate this toxic politics, this rabid tribalism and anger. And we can either face the truth or be destroyed by lies. We can either descend further into chaos and rancor, or we can try to rise above to meet the test with real courage and patriotism. Here in my state of Maryland, I believe we have shown a better way. Despite the fact that my state is overwhelmingly Democratic and my legislature is controlled by 70% progressive Democrats, I'm a Republican, we have worked together to create the biggest economic turnaround in America. We've cut taxes, we've lowered the cost of healthcare, and worked on rebuilding our infrastructure. And as a result, I'm proud to have the support of more than 70% of every single demographic in our state. And I think we've shown that if you actually focus on fixing the problems and reaching across the aisle, that an overwhelming majority of Republicans and Democrats and independents will approve of the job that you're doing. And I'm urging the Democrats and Republicans in Washington to take the same approach, starting with this next COVID-19 relief bill. That's the only way we're going to restore faith in our country, both at home and abroad. And I want to thank you, and I look forward to the discussion today.
Governor and General, thank you very much for joining us. It is a pleasure to meet you and honor to talk with you about such an important subject, because frankly, it's one that needs to be had in this country. It's obvious that not just in the last few months, but the last several years, that we are seeing this acrimony and partisanship, this great divide, worsen and worsen. General Clark, you mentioned at the top about January 6th, and we need to start there. I think as a country, as a discussion, an armed insurrection that turned deadly, attempting to stop the process of certifying the election on the very symbol of democracy in the world. seems we need to look inward before we can start the process of reestablishing international partnerships, global partnerships. That needs to happen first, doesn't it, General Clark, in your view, that as much as we're trying to reach out with this new administration outside this country, there are serious questions that need to be answered about why are there so many disenfranchised and why can't we come together in compromise?
Yeah. Well, I think, Rob, that you have to look at three things to do right now. Number one is you have to do accountability. People that broke into government property and trashed the Capitol and so forth and killed those police officers, and five dead and so forth. There has to be accountability. That's an act of lawlessness, and whether it's done by the left or right, it can't be tolerated. Second thing is, I think you have to explain again to the American people the constitutional system. Now there were a lot of people in that crowd who they didn't know why they were there, or they didn't understand what the system is. Now, when I was an Army officer at the National War College, they used to send out groups across America of Army officers who would explain national security policy. And they go to places just like this, like the World Affairs Council, and they'd say, here's America's foreign policy and security policy. And I think that, and I hope the Biden administration will do this, that I hope they'll establish some bipartisan teams that will go out and reestablish the legitimacy of the American constitutional process. In America, we believe the process is more important than the outcome. You see, somewhere back in the 1980s, we got a little bit offline. We begin to think that politics is about values, and values are hard to compromise. And once you set your flagpole down and say, this is what I believe, well, it's very hard for somebody who doesn't believe that to either has to come to your side, or she has to come to your side, or your enemies. America really wasn't set up that way. It was really set up to compromise interests. That's the structure. It's interests. And so we have a sphere of privacy where we can share values, we can have differing values, but we have to come together for government to compromise interests. And so the
criminal,
Rob, we have to, it's just what the governor said. It has to work at the DC level. The federal government has to work. So it's accountability, explaining, and then proving that government can work, starting with the COVID relief bill and dealing with the many other issues in front of the American people. They want to see relief. They want to see an effective vaccine program. They want to see guidance on how to get back in school. They want the CDC to be focused on science, not on politics. They want to have people in public life they can trust. So those are the three categories of things that I think we need to be looking at right now.
The criminality, I understand, that needs to be prosecuted, that needs to be weeded out. Governor, the fact of the matter is that 70 million plus Americans voted for President Trump, and there is a vast majority of them that believe that this election was stolen. They still believe that. How do you change the message initially to start with, and then work from there to try and bring both sides together? That seems like an imperative right now.
Well, Rob, that is the difficult thing that we've got to figure out how to do. First of all, let me just say that I agree with General Clark. I mean, there needs to be accountability, not only for those who committed these horrific acts, but also those who fanned the flames of hate with lies and conspiracy theories. So, we've got, this was not just an attack on a building. This was, attacked the very heart of our democracy in America. So, but accountability isn't enough. I mean, I think we do have to recognize that we're in a situation today where, people are getting information that's not always true. And then, and there's a void and a vacuum. As I was saying earlier, Americans have lost faith that the political process can actually work for them, and that Washington is broken and unable to do anything. And so I think we have to address the root problem. I think showing that we can work together in a bipartisan way to actually improve people's lives and to work on the things that everybody actually cares about is a step in the right direction, but we've got a long way to come. Obviously, the country is so divided. I just happen to believe that there is more that unites us than divides us, and it's going to take a lot of work.
Just briefly about the messaging, we are now seeing some of these larger social media companies now beginning to, it's basically censorship. They've decided to shut down certain Twitter accounts, etc., to try and control messages that are going out. How important is that when you talk about the constitutionality of what's going on? Is that a remedy? Is that the right thing in the midst of what we are seeing here? Governor, go ahead.
Yeah, I don't think it's the right remedy. Look, I understand how and why we got to the point where they took these actions in the middle of an insurrection, with the vast amount of total misinformation that was being spread by social media that did help contribute to the crisis. But taking away people's First Amendment rights of free speech is a pretty slippery slope, and who gets to decide, who's going to be doing the censoring? And maybe people with these views can't speak on these platforms, but the people with these views can. And so I think we got to be very careful before we move in that kind of a direction.
Yeah, I agree.
General, I'm very frustrated with social media.
I agree that we're on a slippery slope, but I think it goes back to the old principle on what's the restriction on freedom of speech. And I think Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes gave it to us over 100 years ago. He said, you can't cry fire in a crowded theater. So there are certain limits to what you can do in freedom of speech. And at this point in the American democracy, the internet with the algorithms that drive articles to people, it's like a weapon of mass destruction of democracy. If you're looking for one particular thing, if you're shopping for washing machines, you're going to learn more than you ever wanted about washing machines. But if you're looking for conspiracy theories and you have something there, it's going to feed it and feed it and feed it. There's nothing in that mechanism that says, hey, there's another side of the story. And so I think the shutting off the Twitter account, so forth, that's a stopgap measure. That's not the solution. But we do need to look at the impact of social media on democracies, not only here, but around the world. People recognize that this is something new, and we have to look at it and regulate it and think about it the right way.
And frankly, voters, taxpayers have to do their job too, in terms of understanding and filtering out those things and understanding the differences between what is legitimate news and what is commentary or editorial. And that's a whole nother discussion. Going to move to the next question here, gentlemen. And Governor, I'll begin with you. America's standing in the world is informed by what happens here at home. What specific policy changes do you believe we can make to increase bipartisanship, reduce political dysfunction? And again, this applies both on the national level, the state level, the local level, and therefore restore faith in American leadership and democracy. What are some of the things you're doing in your state to try and improve that position of not only your state, but how we're viewed globally?
Well, I think one critical step that we could and should take is nonpartisan redistricting reform. This is something that I've been working on here in my state. There's been discussions about it at the federal level, but all across the country, politicians are picking their voters when the voters should be picking the politicians. And this means that, legislators end up in highly gerrymandered and very partisan districts where they only have to worry about appealing to the extremes of one party or another. They don't have to really be competitive with most voters in a general election. It's not only wrong, but it leads to hyper-partisanship and the political dysfunction and gridlock that we're seeing. So in my state, I've taken the unprecedented step of giving up my power and appointing a nonpartisan citizen commission to remove politics from the process. And I'm going to keep fighting for these common sense reforms at the national level. I really do think it's one of the reasons why nothing gets done in Congress. It's one of the reasons for the hyper-partisanship. We don't get people that are willing to reach across and talk to the folks on the other side. We don't get people that are moderates or, left of center or right of center. And, we end up with people on both ends of the extreme that are in elective office that don't represent the vast majority of people.
Just as an aside, we've created a commission here in Colorado that's comprised now of Republican, Democrats, and unaffiliated voters to try and develop this redistricting issue. On a global standpoint, General Clark, speak to the question about our standing in the world and what happens here at home and what message it's sending to our allies and our adversaries globally.
Well, a message right now that's come out is that democracy doesn't work. I was in with the ambassador from Egypt about a year and a half ago, and he was telling me, he said, "You Americans," he said, "you have to understand there's an alternative to the United States." And he said, "That's China. China's efficient. China's growing rapidly. China's providing for its people's welfare. It's doing well. Democracy's not the only model." And I think that's the concern, because what happened on January 6th, and really, if you look back at the record of the American government for, go back 12 years, really, to the start of the Obama administration, and ask what's really been done. Well, we tried to get a health care bill passed, and it wasn't accepted in much of the country, and people have railed against it in Congress for 10 or 12 years, and yet there's no alternative to health insurance. And we never got an infrastructure bill passed, and the recovery was slow, and there's still pockets of long-term secular unemployment, and we're outsourcing technology and jobs, and people look at the country, they say, something's wrong here. And when people in America say that, just as Governor Hogan was saying earlier, we don't believe in ourselves, they're not going to believe in us. In December, Europe signed a comprehensive agreement on investment with China. And it sent shockwaves through the United States, because we always look at Europe as, well, it's sort of ours. We fought 2 world wars to save Europe from being dominated by a hostile power. You know, look, China's not exactly like the Cold War, but they'd like to replace us and change the global system, and they're not a democracy and likely to become one. So our values and China's values don't exactly coincide. And here's Europe signing a comprehensive investment agreement with China. So it was a real shock, and yet it's a reflection of how people see the United States. The Europeans are looking at it and say, these Americans, we got to get some distance. They've been crazy recently, where they want to pull troops out of NATO. They want to break up agreements. They pulled out of the Iranian agreement without any logic or any replacement to it. Can't trust them, not reliable. So that's the danger. So it's what most of us say is, got to fix what's at home to rebuild our alliances, reestablish America's role in the world, or we can't deal with the rise of China.
Governor, I wanted to talk about in your state specifically, and just in the last, is there a willingness on the part of politicians in Maryland, and just generally speaking, do you believe, about wanting to heal, about wanting to move forward, or what is your take on that? Because if there's not a willingness to do anything, nothing's going to change, is it?
Well, you're absolutely right about that, Rob. I think there's still a pretty big disconnect between many of our elected officials on both sides of the aisle and the actual voters. Multiple national surveys have shown that 70-some% of the American people are completely disgusted with our political process, and they're angry at Republicans and Democrats, and they don't trust Washington. They think our political system is broken. And, I think a lot of them would love to see, in the introduction earlier, they said, I was one of them, I had one of the highest approval ratings of any of the governors. The reason is not because I'm a charming guy. It's just that in our state, in order to get anything done, I've got to work together with Democrats who I don't always agree with. It turns out that's what people want, and we're not getting that out of, they really are so tired of the angry rhetoric and we were talking about the social media, but the back and forth. The general started out saying, because you disagree on an issue, that doesn't make someone your enemy. We've got to find a way to disagree without being disagreeable, and we've got to find a way to listen to the other side, because we've all share the same problems. These aren't Republican problems or Democratic problems, and we need to come together to come up with the solutions. I think it's what people want. I'm not sure the politicians are all getting the message yet, though, and that's the problem.
General Clark, I wanted to get your take on something. We're seeing to some degree, internal fighting within parties. For example, the representative from Wyoming, Liz Cheney, they had to have a vote basically to allow her to maintain her power in the House. But yet in her home state of Wyoming, the legislature there voted to censure her. And we're seeing that kind of conflict within parties themselves. How do we solve that from the federal down to the state level? And then to pick up on what the governor said, then move forward to try and work with the other side?
Well, I think you have to focus first on what's good, what's the common interest, what's good for the people. To do that, I think you need to get some of the money out of politics. Now, there are always going to be people who want to contribute and pitch in and help, and that's fine. But you know, most Americans can't afford to give $2,700 to someone running for office. They just can't afford it, and that's what the maximum individual contribution is. And back in the 1970s, a program was started by the Chamber of Commerce, and I'm a businessman. I like the Chamber of Commerce. Don't get me wrong, but they said, look, corporations are just people. And so whatever they want to do, that's freedom of speech, and they should be able to contribute as much to the political process as they want. And this led into the Citizens United decision in 2010 that's really opened the floodgates. Imagine spending $2 billion, $2.5 billion on an election. Think of what that money could do for schools and healthcare and children. And we're spending it on advertisements, on media. Surely we can do that. And the advertisements don't even talk about the issues. Most of them are attack messages. So we need to get the money out of politics so people can work together. But there's something deeper than this, Rob. Now, go back a few ways. Back in the 1980s, Democrats and Republicans did work together. But there's a friend of mine named Newt Gingrich who came along and he said to the Republicans, he said, look here, if you all stay agreeable to these Democrats, you're never going to be a majority party. And so he dug in, he put out the Contract for America, and the Republicans became a party in opposition. And that's okay to a certain extent, but you still should come together and work for the common interest. And that's been real hard because the two parties have diverged. Back when I was growing up, there were liberal Republicans and there were conservative Republicans, and there were liberal Democrats and conservative Democrats. And all the political scientists said, why these parties are all messed up. They don't even stand for anything. It's true. What they did is they represented their constituents and they worked together to get things done for the country. That's how we built America. That's how we made America great. But once the parties became pure and more ideological, then it was harder to compromise. And so now what we have is we're reaching the end of a cycle. We had 40 years of attacking big government and saying business is better. Well, okay, but there's some real holes in the American economy because when you focus too much on the profit motive and what's good for the individual, you lose sight of what's good for everybody. So the pendulum in American politics swings in 40 and 50 and 60-year cycles. It's swinging back. That's what you see on the left wing of the Democratic Party. And on the right wing of the Republican Party, what you're seeing is just a sense of it's just really strongly personal. And it's I just don't want to go there really, but it's just the American people are going to have to they're going to have to learn to deal with what happened over the last 4 years. It's going to be a tough reconciliation for a lot of people.
Governor, one of the participants here sent in a question, could give an example or two of how emotional conservative and liberal issues could be moderated and work together. And that kind of dovetails into my next question about what we saw today, day one of this impeachment trial in the Senate. And as we're here discussing ways to try and bring civility and bring parties together, find compromise, and there's two sides of this argument here. We need to move on, or this president needs to be rebuked in terms of what you may or may not believe as to what happened to inspire what went on at the Capitol on January 6th. How does this impeachment trial play into all this now that we're in this mode of trying to kickstart some kind of bipartisanship?
Well, unfortunately, I don't think it's very helpful. Look, I was one of the first to come out the first day when this insurrection happened, and I was very blunt and direct and said I thought the president should, resign or be removed from office. But I also happen to feel that right now I'm not sure whether this partisan process in Congress is exactly what we need now that the president's already left office after this horrible attack on our democracy. I think we need to show the world that we can stand together. And what we desperately need right now is to get a focus on, instead of the past, focus on the emergency crisis situation we're dealing with right now, both the twin crisis of the pandemic, where we desperately need help with vaccines and money for state and local governments who are out on the front lines, and we need economic recovery to turn this economy around. And so, what we do need accountability, but we also need unity. And what we got instead was more division and dysfunction. And I just think it's another example of what we've been talking about. The dysfunction and divisiveness in Washington is, I think, hurting our country, both at home and abroad. And so I'd like to put this chapter behind us. I'm not saying the president shouldn't be held accountable. I just think we ought to get focused on some of the things that most people are concerned about right now.
General Clark, quickly, if you could respond to that as well before we move on, just your thoughts about this impeachment trial as we're working to try and find compromise, unity, civility, and bipartisanship.
I think we got to get it over with. But I will tell you one story. I talked to several Republican friends of mine, some who are office holders, and the truth is they have a different view in private than they can express in public. And as one man said to me, he said, look, I can't vote for impeachment because my own legislators will attack me and more than that. And when you have a party that's more afraid of its voters than it is representing the voters, when it can't educate but can only follow the loudest voices, there's a problem there. And I'm not inside that party, so I don't want to prescribe to it. But I think, it's a conflict between principles. We've got to hold them accountable. We got to move on. How are we going to do it? And I think America's a big enough country. We can walk and chew gum at the same time. So let's get on with the trial. Let's get it through. Let's get the evidence out there. Set the matter there for the historical record. I hope he's barred from running for office again because he was not an effective president. That's just my view as someone who's, worked for 7 or 8 presidents. But we got to pull the country together and work together.
All right, I want to move on here as our time is winding down, and we want to share both of your story with those who have joined us today. And first to General Clark, Renew America Together. For those who don't know, now more than 2 years in existence. How is your foundation working? Is it working? What have you learned given the current circumstances in this country? And you have said that it provides you the opportunity to see America through the eyes of other people around the world. What are you hearing, good or bad? And then I have a follow-up question. So speak to what your nonprofit is doing. Is it working? And what feedback are you getting in this particular time in history?
It's an amazing thing to go out with someone like Governor Hogan or former Treasury or Transportation Secretary Andy Card or Governor Tom Ridge of Pennsylvania, because people really do speak out and you can really talk about the issues in an effective way. You can get to the issues away from the personalities. And so we've been very lucky to be able to do that. We've soldiered on right through the COVID crisis. In fact, we've probably done more presentations like this on Zoom and they've worked just as well. Of course, it's always better to look at the audience in the face as you're talking and so forth, but we can reach more people this way. And what we're going to be doing starting this coming year is we've got a new program. So we're going to be able to bring in party activists, the low-level party activists who make American democracy work, and bring them together and let them exchange views and communicate with each other and really talk about the issues so that it's not just not just a hammer coming down from the top, but it's really people getting together with their neighbors and people from different states and saying, well, here's the real problem we're trying to address, and trying to find solutions that way and build bridges at the bottom, not just at the top.
And what is the message you're hearing from people around the world that you're in contact with right now? I know you spoke a little bit about some of the things that are happening overseas, but is there anything specific to your reaching out as a part of your nonprofit that really hits home that you feel needs to be addressed?
Well, every country has more or less the same problem, even in different systems. So when you go to France, for example, you had the Yellow Jacket protest when they tried to deal with carbon pricing in the streets of Paris. And in Germany, you have bitter discussions about immigration and so forth. And in Hungary, they barred immigrants and they're shutting down their democracy. So what I hear from people all around the world is it's a good thing we're trying to do with Renew America Together and set the example and bring it here and make it work here, because we're looking to you. We want your example, and we want to see what can be done to help nations who are democratic nations work more effectively and cohesively internally. We have to prove democracy can work in the modern age.
And are you like recruiting people? Is it something as easy as going to a website for people to get involved or to reach out to kind of spread your mission?
Rob, thank you for that question. Yes, and I should have said that. We would love to have people come and sign up on our website, and we'll keep you informed of what we're doing. We've got postings, we've got articles. We're out there. We're actually trying to be nonpartisan or bipartisan. The idea was to pick people who were, above the asking for dollars. But Governor Hogan's an exception. He's an amazing political leader, as he explained, in the state of Maryland, and it works. But in general, what we wanted to do was open the cloak and say, here's what politics is about. You have to raise money. You have to have issues that define you as distinct from your opponent. You have to reach out to people. You have to shake hands and kiss babies, but you got to stand for something also. And then how do you do that? And then after the elections, come together and work together. So that's really the fabric of what we're trying to discuss here and explain to people across the country how American democracy should work, how it can work, how people from different party backgrounds can agree on most of the issues. And I think you're seeing that here today.
And Governor Hogan, to you now, and your book, Still Standing, Surviving Cancer, Riots, a Global Pandemic, and the Toxic Politics that Divide America. I jokingly, as I was writing down that question, going, this is basically a year in review. I mean, it's a great title, a little joke there. So how does your experience, frankly, translate to a state and national, a state or national conversation about the crisis we face? Are people listening? Again, getting back to this, if they are, what are they telling you? If not, why not?
Well, thank you for giving me a plug for the book. I appreciate that, Rob.
No, we can here, Yeah,
I had this book almost finished just before the crisis hit, and I just finished a few chapters on COVID. I was chairing the National Governors Association during the middle of this pandemic, and I've now, not to take anything away from the generals, Renew America Together, but I've started a foundation that I dedicated all the money from the book to, called An America United. Very similar, even though we're from different parties, we share the same sort of goals of uniting America. And I recently became the chairman of a group called No Labels, which has put together the Problem Solvers Caucus in Congress, made up of 25 Democrats and 25 Republicans who are really sitting down every day trying to reach those compromises that we're talking about. It's what we've done here in Maryland. We're trying to do that in Congress. This group was really responsible for the compromise that brought the last stimulus package through. We had Speaker Pelosi on one end pushing, a line in the sand, and you had Leader McConnell on the other end saying, we're not budging. And for 8.5 months, that was stuck. And No Labels and the Problem Solvers Caucus dragged them both to the middle and got it done. So it's only one example, but I think we've shown that it can be done here in my state. I mentioned before, more than 2/3 of both houses of my legislature are Democrats, and we've gotten a heck of a lot done. I became only the second Republican in 243 years to be reelected in the state of Maryland. So they must have thought we were successful at solving some problems. But it really was just like what I'm preaching to you about, that the general and I've been talking about, ending the divisive rhetoric and just sitting down and working together. You know, it doesn't mean you're always going to agree. We disagree passionately on some things, but I think you can find that common ground where we can all stand together. It is a big uphill climb. It's not easy to do, but it's something I believe very strongly in. And I know it can work. If we can do it here in the state of Maryland, which is the most democratic state in America as a Republican, there's no place in America where the same principles won't succeed.
It is frustrating, though, when you have to bring in essentially a third party coalition to try and grab these leaders by the shirt tail or the collar or the scarf or whatever you want to say and say, listen, this is what needs to be done. Why is that so difficult when these people are elected to get things done? It's just frustrating for so many and so many levels.
Well, Rob, it is frustrating to almost all of us. But as the general pointed out, you know, the politics has gotten so divided, and there's two teams. You know, they're all trying to beat the other team. Instead of saying, forget about the politics in the next election, let's try to figure out how to solve problems. It's the way it used to be. You know, my dad was in Congress back in the 70s, and I remember, you know, some of his closest friends were Democrats. They would argue passionately on the floor about something they disagreed on, and then they'd go out and have a beer together or have dinner together. Our families were friends. And now it seems as if you have to make somebody your mortal enemy because they happen to have a D or an R next to their name. You know, some of these folks in the Problem Solvers Caucus, they're almost ostracized because they're not towing the party line in their caucus. And they're like, why are you talking to those other guys on the other team? Well, this is what they should all be doing. You know, that's what the American people want.
General Clark, I wanted to go ahead. I'm sorry.
I just want to come in on this because I think Governor Hogan is exactly right on this. Look, what happened is in an effort to promote transparency and better democracy, we actually took away the tools that let Congress work more effectively together. We have on television Congress all day long, so you can see who exactly is doing what. Now, it was always printed in the congressional record, but that's different. And so people are watching this. You can't socialize with each other. Especially, I remember my wife, when my wife worked for a Republican senator, I remember Congressman Tom DeLay, who told other Republicans, you talk to those Democrats, you're out. We'll primary you and get you out of this Congress. And so there was an effort to really improve party discipline. That's a good thing, but it's also a bad thing because it kept people from working together. And then we got really on a high horse and we said, no more earmarks, no more talking about, hey, I'll vote for a new post office in your congressional district if you'll vote for that interstate highway addition in my district. That's how Congress used to work. They called it log rolling. I used to teach political science at West Point. We had a book called, it was a little booklet called How a Law is Made, and it talked about those compromises. Now what's happened is the parties are ideologically distinct, and so they run on national issues. And so it's about, hey, what about gun control? Well, you know, what about abortion? What about taxes? Those are the three big issues that tend to define parties, not what's good for the local community.
What about getting us some vaccines and getting us a relief bill done?
Exactly.
Hey, let me interject here real quick. Obviously, the two-party system is what has been the backbone of this country for decades, since, you know, the days this country was created. But here in Colorado, for example, there are now more unaffiliated voters than there are Democrats or Republicans. And in some counties, in fact, that were predominantly Democrat or Republican, now unaffiliated voters are now either equal to or exceeding them. Gentlemen, I'd like to get your take on how does a third or fourth party start to intervene here when it seems the rules are set against the creation of that very thing that you would think would break up this two-party system that seems to be just spinning its wheels and its gridlock nonstop. Governor, I'll start with you.
Well, Rob, it's an excellent question. I hear that a lot, and we've talked about that when people are leaving and they're fleeing both parties, and that's happening across the country. It goes back to what I said earlier, that 70-some% of the people in America do not believe in the far left of the Democratic Party or the far right of the Republican Party. They fall somewhere in the middle. They're either consider themselves, they self-identify as being a moderate or just slightly left of center or right of center. They're in the middle. They're not at the 20-yard lines. They're in the middle of the field. And so they're, you know, in our state, the largest growing population is among independents or unaffiliated members. The Democrats are shrinking and the Republicans are shrinking. And I think that's happening in other places. So you know, because people are turned off by the two parties, but our system is set up that way. So it's still nearly impossible for a third party candidate to be elected under the current, you know, rules that we have. So while a lot of people are independent in their thinking, for example, my state is only 26% Republican. They were very independent minded. They crossed over and voted for me. I got all the independents, but a huge chunk of Democrats. You know, so they'll vote for independent type candidates or people that are willing to work together. But an independent party or a third party is a tough climb. I mean, our two parties. I'm a big believer in the competitiveness of a two-party system and arguing our ideas and standing up for what we believe in. But we've got to figure out a way to make it work better.
General Clark, would the establishment are moving towards involvement of more unaffiliated voters or trying to create some circumstance where that could become a more predominant party or ideology, what have you, be a part of your Renew America Together plan? Is that something you would sign on to, or do you believe that's something that needs to happen?
Well, I think there are real problems with trying to just establish a third party because the parties have very specific functions. They mobilize voters, they work the issues, they train candidates, and of course, then they bring them to the Hill and then they help put together partisan agendas. And this is the way that the people's views are expressed. When you come in a third party, like a libertarian candidate, we have libertarians in Arkansas, but there's not really a party there to support them. There's no one to go knock on doors. There's nobody that really organizes it. And if they ever come up with a good issue, one of the two parties is going to steal it. And that's kind of the way it works. That's why we've retained a two-party system, because for any issue, there's somebody who's more on this side than on the other side. And it sort of naturally divides. You're either sort of leaning that way or the other. Try to put something up in the center with a congressional system with single member constituencies like we have, where there's one congressman from each district, then it's hard to create a third party system. Our European allies have systems that have multiple parties, but they don't necessarily do that well. And in the case of the Brits, of course, that third party is always getting squeezed out because it's a single member constituency. So, and I
think that most people understand how the process works, and I think there's probably an attitude on the part of those who don't want to take the risk because they know, as you had mentioned, either one of you, I forget which, that if they put out a good idea, somebody else is going to take it from the other two parties. We're running short on time here, so I wanted to thank you both. You've done a fascinating job of explaining where you're at, where this country's at, but where we need to improve, and you know, we need to go there because something is terribly wrong. We have a few minutes left where I want to give each of you an opportunity to speak for a couple of minutes finally about where you are, where our priorities should be moving forward. And I'm going to begin with too many G's. Governor Hogan, please, got 2 or 3 minutes here if you could. Talk a little bit more about what your vision is for this country and your state, frankly.
Well, thank you, Rob, and thank you, General. It's been a great conversation. Look, we've talked a lot tonight about the problem, but I believe there's a reason for hope. I believe that the American people are not as divided as our politics would suggest. And so many politicians believe that the only way to get elected is to feed the extremes, and the only way to govern is through winner-take-all combat. While social media and cable news, talk radio are all dominated by the extreme voices, they only represent a tiny sliver of Americans on the far left and the far right. But according to polling, over 70% of the American people belong to what has been dubbed the exhausted majority. These are people who are simply fed up with that kind of politics and who feel ignored by Washington and forgotten by both political parties. So ultimately, the overwhelming majority of Americans want the same things. They want humble, tolerant, respectful, and effective leaders who are willing to work across the aisle together to find bipartisan common sense solutions. And they want us to appreciate that no one has all the answers or all the power. They want a free and open discourse that tolerates contrary views among a diverse citizenry without turning political adversaries into enemies or doubting their patriotism. They want a government that protects the vulnerable but doesn't dictate how we live our lives. They want a strong America that stands for its allies, for freedom and human dignity in the world, but that doesn't take for granted the sacrifices required for it. And I believe that if we can convince that majority that this type of America isn't just a relic of a bygone era, but that it's actually an ideal that we can aspire to reach for once again, but we've got to keep fighting. We got to keep working every day to get there. I just want to thank General Clark. I want to thank you, Rob. I want to thank the World Affairs Council and everyone who took time to tune in this evening. This is a very important topic, and I thank you for hosting and inviting us.
Governor, thank you. General Clark, same question to you. Just give us your perspective as we close out here about your aspirations for your nonprofit, but just for this country and voters and taxpayers in this country. It's the greatest country in the world.
I'm very close to what Governor Hogan said. Look, government has to work for us. It's our government. It's not the enemy in Washington. But we're responsible for making it work for us. What should it do? Well, it should provide for the common defense. So we've got to have the armed forces. We've got to have Homeland Security. We've got to have the Central Intelligence Agency. We've got to have the things that the institutions of statecraft and military security that protect us. But government also has to set the guardrails that protect us in society. It can't be a dog-eat-dog society. So you've got to have some rules of the road. That means government has to look at the markets. How do the financial markets work? Is there a minimum wage? If people wanted to work for $1 an hour instead of starving, would that be a good thing? Living in a cardboard shack like a favela in some South American country? No, that wouldn't be a good thing. So government sets the guardrails for us. Government has to assure that we can have equal opportunity as best possible, and government has to provide a safety net. Now, these are the principles of American government as they've evolved for the last 200 and some odd years. And as we've gone through and modernized our economy, moved from being a farming nation to an industrialized nation, and now into a post-industrial nation, we continue to have to modernize our expectations of government. But the basic principle is government must work for us. We have to set the rules for the government. We have to be knowledgeable of the issues. We have to follow our duties and our responsibilities by voting. 90 million people didn't vote in the last presidential election. How can that be in this country? But it is. So we have our own responsibilities. If we do that and we believe in the process that's proven to work, and we ask for government to work for us instead of simply attacking it as the enemy, we will prove that democracy is the most effective form of government because it liberates the human spirit. It frees for entrepreneurship. It lets us give expression to our values. None of that can be done in China, only here. But we can't do it without a government that works for us.
General Wesley Clark, Governor Larry Hogan, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your perspectives tonight. I'm going to turn it back over to John Cameron now. John, thank you.
Well, thank you. My name is John Krieger. I'm the Executive Director of World Denver. And on behalf of my colleagues at the World Affairs Councils of Colorado Springs and Foothills, I want to thank our speakers for their time this evening, their service to our country, and their pursuit of civility and bipartisanship in our national politics and our foreign policy. I also want to thank our moderator, Rob Quirk, for facilitating this important and timely conversation. And I especially want to thank our partners at the League of Women Voters for their sponsorship and outreach. And of course, a huge thank you to Renew America Together for bringing this program, which was 14 months in the making, to Colorado. All of our organizations have worked diligently over the last year to keep our members and communities globally engaged and connected during these times of isolation. So please watch our newsletters and our websites for upcoming events. And I invite you all to join World Denver for the 9th annual International Women's Day celebration, broadcast live from the Denver Center for Performing Arts on March 8th. This year, we'll be honoring the accomplishments and leadership of women in national security. That event is free and open to all, and you can register today at worlddenver.org. Thanks again one more time to our speakers and to Rob for an incredible program, and for everyone for taking some time tonight to join us. Everyone, please stay safe, and we will see you all again soon.
Thank
John
you.
Krieger, I apologize for calling you John Cameron. My mistake, sir. Sorry about that. Thank you so much, everybody.
Both General Clark and Governor Hogan, come to Colorado. We'll see you. We'll bring you here soon.
That sounds great.
We'll be there soon. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Governor. Thanks, Rob.
Yeah.